And so there was a lot of, people didn't really know about the degree of connectivity. And I just wanted to show you, these are just a handful of examples that I think tell you something about out-island life. You hear often that it was difficult, that there was sort of infrequent economic contact. But what you see are people investing in things in households that I think, if I had limited economic resources, would be relatively hard for me to obtain. They're getting brand new dishes, nice dishes for their home. They're getting irons. They have enough. There's something going on that they care about their appearance. They're investing in things, that's a luxury item. You could go your whole life without ironing your clothes. I've tried it, that was college, right? But these people bought an iron. You have limited resources, you still invest in that because your personal presentation is still important to you. I love this little clasp. It's probably a little clasp from a diary or a book or a journal, right? These are all late 19th century artifacts at a time that we don't really know what's going on historically, and there's supposed to be this economic isolation. One of my favorite things that we found is this bottle that actually is photographic developing fluid, chemicals for developing photos. And it was probably reused. It was a nice intact bottle. I'm sure they were using it for other things. I'm sure the water tasted a little funny the first few times they used the bottle, but they probably were reusing it for all kinds of things because it was a good bottle to have. I took a photograph of it and I sent it to the company historian at Eastman Kodak. It's an Eastman Kodak bottle. You can kind of see here, if you use your imagination, there's an E and a K. And it dates from the 1890s. In the 1890s is when the Chicago Herald, for the 1892, sent a group of journalists to commemorate Columbus's voyage to the New World, and they put the monument on the wrong side of the island. So this is now a trek and very isolated from all of the other ones because you don't land the boat on the side of the island where the wind is blowing your boat to the island. But they were journalists, not sailors, so we'll give them their due. But they put the monument up. I am sure that's the most likely way that a large thing of photographic development fluid to send their newsprint and newspapers back got onto the island. People were able to take those objects and use them. So I think they were both very resourceful, but also had a lot of other things going on. I don't think that life was quite as isolated as people thought it was. There's a lot of other things going on. So we have this very distinct picture of a long-term progression of changing sort of architecture, changing diets, changing artifacts, different ways of people obtaining things over this period of time. And so what we wanted to do is take Farquarson, the site of Prospect Hill, and put it into this bigger picture that we had been able to create, interestingly, at a plantation with absolutely no historical documentation. This is an archaeology-only story. So by looking at just what the archaeology is telling you, it's interesting to see the story that's emerging. And John's going to sort of bring you into Prospect Hill by talking about Care Mount, which actually was owned by Charles Farquharson in the later part of his life.
We did an excavation at Care Mount 3 years ago. A very brief excavation. It's sort of what really got us interested in Farquharson and Prospect Hill Plantation. And one of the things that we were really interested in Prospect Hill is to sort of understand these two properties that Farquharson owned, and to try to understand how the two of them also work together as a much more complex plantation site. Care Mount was also really interesting because it's completely different than the other plantations, at least that we looked at on the island. We know that it was the land was at least granted to William Kerr in 1818. Probably the plantation developed very quickly after that. We know that Charles Farquharson owns the plantation by the 1830s. But we also know that by the 1830s that it was probably largely abandoned except as a workspace. It has a large central plantation yard, much like other plantations. But it was also abandoned very quickly. And one of the characteristics of this rapid abandonment is we found relatively few artifacts at Care Mount. And it's exactly what you would expect. You know, if somebody only lives somewhere for maybe 10 years or less, there simply isn't going to be a lot that was left there. We do know, however, that the site was a continued work area. The fields were still used. Perhaps, certainly, there were people going through this central yard, but it doesn't seem to have necessarily been an area of everyday occupation. So it's kind of like the null set in our, this is what it looks like if nobody's there for a long period of time, versus other kinds of plantations that had long occupation. The Kermount Yard is sort of a typical sort of Georgian design. It has a central structure. So this was the main the main building. I wouldn't call it a manor house. There were actually two very nicely balanced buildings out in front. Student who actually did a reconstruction. So this is probably what the main house looked like. This is the other side of the main house. And here you can see sort of a reconstruction of the cotton gin area. One of the interesting things about Kermount is that this main building really wasn't a manor house. It clearly was on the first floor a utilitarian building. It has large, wide doors for storage. It has work areas out in the front and back. It probably had some kind of living quarters up above, but not necessarily for a full-time traditional resident planter. So one of the great things about Kermount too is the realization that people who came in and built plantations weren't always necessarily planning on living there. And Kerr had other plantations on other islands. It's probably not his main plantation. And so he didn't necessarily build it to be a main plantation. And so it's always important to remember that even though plantations may have longer lives, many of the buildings sort of reflect that initial intentions of the planter. So what we really wanted to do when we moved to Prospect Hill, and this is very preliminary, we've only had one season of Prospect Hill, we're still very much analyzing what we're doing there. One of the things that we were really interested in is really trying to put Prospect Hill in a context. First of all, how does it compare to other plantations on San Salvador? I mean, really, can we get a sense of how is it part of a larger island system? We really want to get a sense of sort of looking at the historical work that's already been done at Farquarson's, but then really trying to add in sort of this archaeological component to better understand Prospect Hill in a series of archaeological sites, in a series of interconnected plantations. One of the ways that we're sort of looking at that is through architectural comparisons. What's sort of similar about these plantations and what's different? And what might that actually tell us about the planters and the initial plantations? And similarly doing artifact comparisons to understand that each of these plantations has a different set of artifacts that are being left. And what does that tell us about the development of plantations in the Bahamas? So one of the ways that we've sort of been doing is trying to rethink Prospect Hill through historic records. Farquarson's journal is this really rich record that has already been certainly been researched and worked through in the past, but we're going to go ahead and try to give it another go and see if there's things that we can sort of pull from it. And one of the things that we've been particularly interested in pulling from Prospect Hill is trying to look, and Farquarson's journal, is trying to look at it through sort of the eyes of the archaeologist. So what does it tell us about place? How does it describe the plantation? What can it actually tell us about a physical environment? What does it say about daily life and practices? Particularly ways in which the journal may give signs of how people interact with material culture. Anything from farming, agriculture, building walls, dealing with plantation buildings. What does it tell us about how the kinds of things that we would find artifactually might be actually been used? We're also looking really for examples of how the plantation interacts with Kermount, with other plantations on the island, and with the larger world in Nassau. And the O'Brien papers, which are the Farquharson family papers, mostly dating to the post-emancipation period, can also be used in the same way to try to understand what this plantation was like as a space. Some, perhaps not quite so much information on daily life and practices, but certainly it also gives a good sense of how the plantation after emancipation continued to interact in this larger world. So let me give some examples of sort of some very preliminary examples of what we can do. One of the things that we looked at were sort of some issues from a building construction. So we looked specifically at what these different, both the O'Brien papers and Farquharson's journal tell us about building construction and re-roofing and the kinds of maintenance that needed to be done on plantations. A great deal about field use, both the sense of how fields were used by the planter himself and also by individual slaves on the plantation. Really looking at the ways in which this particular plantation was a complex plantation that involved two different sites, involving supervising and sending workers to two different locations. And also